monetary thing, but it's their story. Look at Deuteronomy, 5th book of the Bible, Deuteronomy 26. You did bring a Bible, didn't you? Deuteronomy 26, verses 1 through 10. As you're going to discover later, Deuteronomy is Moses' retelling of the story of the Great Escape to the generation that either wasn't born yet or were children at the time. So Moses is an old man. They've spent 40 years in the desert cooling their heels. And before Moses allows them to go ahead and cross over, he retells the story. And as part of that, he gives them instructions for what to do when they get there. There's a great deal of law then in Deuteronomy. And there's also this. The 26th chapter of Deuteronomy explains that when you get to your land, when harvest time comes, you should have a little Thanksgiving celebration. And you collect a basket of goody things and you give them to the priest. Look at verse 4. Then the priest shall take the basket from your hand and set it down before the altar of the Lord your God. And you shall make response before the Lord your God. Quote, a wandering Aramaean was my father, and he went down into Egypt and sojourned there, few in number. And there he became a nation, great, mighty, and populous. And the Egyptians treated us harshly and afflicted us and laid upon us hard bondage. Then we cried to the Lord, the God of our fathers, and the Lord heard our voice and saw our affliction, our toil, and our oppression. And the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand, an outstretched arm, with great terror, with signs and wonders, and brought us into this place, and gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. In a paragraph, that's the whole Old Testament. That's the whole Tanakh, right there. Our ancestors were nobodies, but God chose us. He brought us out of slavery in Egypt with a mighty hand, and he gave us this land that we now claim as our own heritage. So in a paragraph, there it is. That's the basic story. And if you want to be even simpler than that, I can tell it to you in one sentence. God takes nobodies and makes them into somebodies. Okay? I mean, in one phrase, in one line, that is the basic Hebrew story. And it's a little longer here in Deuteronomy 25. And we're going to look at it in close in this year and, well, in the whole 4 years of our study. But that's what we begin, not with Genesis, but with Exodus. Who composed these stories? It's a great question to ask, but one that is only important to modern people. The ancients didn't worry about it too much. Tradition has supplied an answer, but not an answer without problems. Tradition tells us that Moses was the author of the first 5 books, the Torah. They're called the books of Moses. But if you think about it, saying they're the books of Moses can be handled 2 ways. It can mean the book that Moses composed, or the book that's about Moses, or the book that Moses owns. Of is open to all of that. Now, in reality, most people who call these writings the books of Moses thought that Moses was the author of them. But there are some other things that you need to consider. First, there are passages in the Tanakh that look beyond the Moses story. I'll just have you look up one of these, because I'll give you like 5 of these. Just one I want you to look up. Look at Genesis 12. First book of the Bible, chapter 12, verse 6. Chapter 12, Genesis, verse 6. Abram passed through the land to the place at Shechem, to the oak of Morah. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land. Now stop right there. That last phrase, at that time, the Canaanites were in the land. From the sense of the speaker, where is the speaker in relationship to the event he's talking about?
Much later.
Much later in time. He's looking back. At that time, back when Abraham walked through the land, Canaanites were there. Okay? So he's looking back in time. Okay, now Moses does come later than Abram in the story, but there are other stories, there are other lines like this where you get a sense that there's a disconnect between the writer and the story. So Numbers 12 verse 3, it says, Moses was very meek. He was the humblest man in all the earth. Now, do you see there's a little tension there? That maybe the humblest man in all the earth wouldn't have written that verse. Okay? Deuteronomy 1:1. Moses spoke these words beyond the Jordan. So from the vantage of the person who's writing down Deuteronomy 1:1, he's on this side of the Jordan. And when these words were spoken, it was on the other side of the Jordan. Or similarly, he talks about Og, a petty king whom the Israelites defeated. Og's iron bedstead, is it not in Ramah of the Ammonites? So the writer is looking back at an event and saying that thing still exists now in Ramah. Okay? So again, you see this distance. And most obviously, the account of Moses' death. Moses' dying is recorded in Deuteronomy 34. So when tradition simply says they're the books of Moses, we do not rush in to imagine that Moses wrote them all. He is clearly the key player through these 5 books. He doesn't surface until Exodus, but he is the key actor in the last 4 books of the 5. So back to the question, who wrote them? It's a little more complicated than to say Moses. Second, there are seams and repetitions that suggest that the writing and collecting of the Torah didn't happen by one character at one time. So, for example, we're going to discover that there are 2 creation stories, that there are 2 times that God makes a covenant with Abram, Genesis 15 and 17. That there are 3 stories of the matriarch, that is, the patriarch's wife, being handed over to foreign kings. Genesis 12 and 20 and 26. You don't need to write that down. We're going to read it eventually. There are 2 names for the sacred mountain. Is it Sinai or is it Horeb? There are 2 versions of the 10 Commandments. One in Exodus 20, one in Deuteronomy 5. Moses, if you notice, was called twice in the reading for today. So it seems that what maybe we have here is a gathering. Think of water streams coming, like a little brook that comes here, another brook comes here, and they join, they become a stream, then another little stream adds. That this is actually how contemporary scholars now imagine the Torah having come together. It wasn't that Moses sat down one night and ripped it off because he was, it was raining. He had something to do. That it's a series of memories and stories that go back, and we're brought together bit by bit by bit. 18th and 19th century scholars tried to pull all these clues together, and they came up with a hypothesis that we call the documentary hypothesis, which is just a fancy way of saying what I talked about streams, that we have a variety of different streams that have come together to lead to the product that we have. A great deal of ink was spilled over, and still is being spilled over this. And I will eventually introduce you to a simplified version of this. But this was, again, 18th and 19th century reflection on the part of scholars. It still carries a great deal of weight, but it doesn't explain it all. There's still so much that is beyond our understanding. So I say today we find the classic statement of the documentary hypothesis not as helpful as it used to be. I might as well let me introduce three streams. Let me give them three of the names. Let me just put them on board here. By the way, my apologies. My penmanship is awful. I will always say what I write before and after I write it, so that you can recognize. One stream we call the old epic tradition. The old epic tradition. It tends to it's a lively style of storytelling that is the basic root account of Genesis through Numbers. It is the old epic tradition that has God walk with Adam in the garden. The idea that God could walk, or that God could lose Adam. Where are you, Adam? God has to call out for Adam. Okay? That God is, he's like a giant human being with a beard. Huh? This storytelling is somewhat, it's beautiful, but it's somewhat simplistic in that regard, that God is just a big creature, almost, in the universe. But it's the stories of creation, the story of the fall, the Noah's flood story. A great deal of the patriarchal stories come from the old epic tradition. Then there is a priestly tradition. Now, I don't know what you think of priests. I don't know that I want to hear it today. But in the Old Testament, what do priests worry about? In the biblical times, they worry about genealogies, who your ancestors were. They worry about keeping dates and books, matters of sacrifice and ritual. So in the Torah, we're going to come across a lot of that. Not every genealogy is by the priestly tradition, but a lot of it is. Lots of ritual, how you do this and how you do that. And when we hear that sort of stuff, those are priestly concerns. A third stream is called the Deuteronomist, like the book Deuteronomy. Deuteronomist tradition. This stream has connections to what we think of as the prophets. It's given to long sentences with a characteristic vocabulary, phrases like, with your whole heart, or that your days may be long, or with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, or the land you are entering, and a great emphasis on covenant and on commitment. Okay? So these are the three great strands that most scholars will recognize weaving in and out. These strands came together into a single work in the 6th or 5th century before Christ, during and after what we call the exile, the Jewish exile. You're going to learn a lot of history, more history than you care to, but again, this first year, you got to know the players, you got to know the rules of the game, or you won't be able to play baseball. You won't be able to catch the story.